many, many people. This all changed when I got to the university level. Here's what happened. I was at a public speaking and debate tournament. I was on the forensics team, and we were going out to our first tournament. Anyone forensics debate? Good. Join it. It's awesome. That was my plug. So I'm on the first tournament for the year, and I'm going to the event, and we're all going to pick roommates. Okay, there's 4 guys on the team. There's me, a guy named David, a guy named Sarad, and another guy named Richard, but he calls himself Rashad. Okay, and to give you a good idea of Rashad, he called himself a Madonna with a RuPaul twist. To say he was a flaming homosexual would be an understatement. So do the math. 4 guys, 3 heterosexuals, 1 homosexual, 2 rooms. David and I looked at each other and we're like, we're rooming together. And Sarad's like, thanks, guys. By the way, Sarad ended up spending the night with us. So that night, everyone on the team goes out. You know, they're all partying. You know, it's great. We've practiced. We're ready. We're going to this tournament. So they all go out. Some of them brought marijuana. They were going to smoke. Some of them went to drink. Some went to go to the clubs. I stayed back because my parents had taught me, Nabeel, you need to be above moral reproach. You need to be of such a high character that anyone who sees you immediately glorifies Allah. That's what my parents had taught me. And then my friend David stayed back. So I said, hey, this is interesting. He's staying back. He's not going out with them. And we started talking, and while we're talking, he pulls out a Bible and starts reading it. I'm like, no way. I got a Christian to take down tonight. And so I look at David, I'm like, David, are you really going to read that book? Yeah. Don't you realize that book is horribly corrupt? He's like, what are you talking about? And I said, think about this for a second. Jesus spoke Aramaic, right? And then the early church spoke Hebrew. And then when the New Testament was written, it was written in Greek. So by the time the New Testament is written, Jesus' words are a translation of a translation. You've already got things that have to be lost in translation because no translation is perfect. And by that point, you have a small church. It's not until the church gets to Rome and the New Testament is translated into Latin, the Vulgate, when you have a popular level Bible. And then that Latin Bible lasts for over 1,000 years. That's the main Bible. And then when you finally get the English Bibles, it's through a German translation. You got the KJV. So that's why today you've got the KJV, the NASB, the NIV, the RSV, the ESV, the who knows what V. You got so many versions of the Bible. How am I supposed to know what the Word of God is? Now, let me give you a little bit of background on David. David had spent 5 years doing nothing but studying apologetics and the Bible. And he's kind of shy. He doesn't like engaging people. So that whole night, he's like, the Lord put me in the room with a Muslim. God, I don't want to start a conversation. If you want me to talk to him, can you get him to start talking? So David's been praying, and he's ready. And he says, Nabeel, let me tell you something. He says the disciples lived in an area that was multilingual. Just because Jesus spoke Aramaic doesn't mean he didn't speak other languages. And the disciples, if they spoke Aramaic, could have written in another language. And it's not the same thing as things being lost in translation. People who are truly multilingual can write thoughts in multiple languages. And at that point, you have a Greek New Testament, which is reconstructed today with total accuracy. And by the way, if we did not have any of our 5,500 Greek New Testament manuscripts to reconstruct the New Testament today, guess what? We have over 30,000 quotations of the New Testament from the patristics with which we can reconstruct almost the entire New Testament as well, plus other translations of the New Testament from ancient times like Latin and Syriac and Coptic. I'm looking at David, I'm like, you are making this up. I have talked to so many Christians and not a single one has ever said any of this to me before. He's like, try me, let's go. And I was like, all right, let's do it. And so we became friends. Like at that moment, we started a relationship where we would go together and yeah, we would go at it with each other, but we were real friends. Like he was doing biology at the time. He wanted to do philosophy and biology and ultimately get his PhD in the problem of evil. And I wanted to do pre-med. So I was in pre-med, so we were in a lot of the same classes together. We went to chemistry together, and we went to bio together, we went to genetics together, we went to evolutionary biology together. That was fun, by the way, because neither David nor I are atheists. We're very much against atheists. And our professor was definitely an atheist. And so she's sitting there teaching like the Greek taxonomy of various beings, like, you know, the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So she's going through all that, and her hair, by the way, it advertises the fact that she's a lesbian atheist. I just said that. I didn't mean to say that. Can we strike that from any kind of record? I'm sure you can. Thank you very much. But so it was just kind of this crazy, like, coming at you, like you can't look away, kind of like a car accident on someone's head, like, you know. And so David and I are sitting there. We can't listen to a word she's saying. We're just coming up with a taxonomy for her hair. You know, that's what we're doing. So we are like real friends. And while we go at it with each other, while we're talking about things that are very important to us, we know that when we're challenging one another, it's not because we want to tear each other down. It's because we want to build each other up. And so when he tells me, Nabeel, the Quran is not the word of God, I'm not hearing, Nabeel, you're inferior because your faith is incorrect. I'm hearing, Nabeel, I want to build you up in the truth, and you're wrong, and I want to share the truth with you. And in reverse, I'm trying to share Islam with him to do the same thing. I'm not trying to tear him down, and he knows it. So this is how our relationship goes. And I cannot encourage you enough to understand the importance of Christian love in evangelism. Okay? Evangelism was not meant to be performed apart from the context of love. They will know you by your love. And if they see you and they're not seeing love, they're not seeing Christ. Period. So in the context of this relationship, we're able to really challenge each other. And I began to see, it took me a year, but I began to see that the New Testament was actually trustworthy. That in fact, today it says what it has always said. I could come up with no model of uniform corruption for the New Testament. The New Testament was spread so rapidly throughout that area that in order for it to get uniformly corrupted, someone would have to recollect all the books of the New Testament, change it, and then redistribute it. And there was just no one in a position to do that at that time, no one at all. In fact, when the books were going around for the most part, to even gather as Christians was a crime under the Diocletian Edict. So I could see no way, no model. And it's easy enough to say, they corrupted the New Testament. Okay, give me some details. How did they corrupt the New Testament? Well, they got together. When did they get together? You know, there was no model to do that. So after a year, I said, okay, the New Testament, trustworthy. But still, inside it, nowhere does Jesus say he is God. Quite the opposite. Jesus makes it very clear he's a man and a prophet. And David and I went into that issue head first. Now, for me today, my ministry, Creed 2.6, which Dave was talking about earlier, is centered around Jesus. Who is he? What was he to the earliest Christians? What does that mean for us today? As believers, I mean, for those of you who have parents who are believers or have been raised in a believing environment, that's a great thing. But one of the downfalls to that is that you are often unable to catch just how radical and how awe-inspiring the incarnation is. That God would become a man, incomprehensible. Why in the world would he do that? How much did he have to give up? What was more humiliating to him, dying naked on the cross or becoming a man to begin with? Hard to wrestle with. And so, as a Muslim, I was taught that God would never compromise his majesty, his lordship, in such a manner as to become the son of carpenter. Quit your sniggering. The son of a carpenter and of a young girl. How would God do that? And not just to be born in that fashion, but then to live in labor his whole life, and then at some point to have to be betrayed by friends and to die on the cross? That makes no sense at all to a Muslim. It makes zero sense. In fact, it's so obviously wrong to a Muslim just because of the degree of humiliation God has to undergo. And so, to me, the biggest issue is Jesus. He is the issue to deal with. And you'll see that coming out today in my talks, and we have a whole session on Jesus as the pivot point. But just to give you a brief intro, at this point, I looked at my friend David and I said, can we know that Jesus claimed to be God? Did he? I don't think so. He doesn't do it in the New Testament. And so we started looking, and the first place anyone goes in order to defend the deity of Christ is the Gospel of John. First place to go, the easiest place. You see things from John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18, the whole prologue to John, very clear. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Nothing that was created in this world was created except through the Word. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld His glory, the glories of the only begotten of God. And the Word is in fact the only begotten God, according to verse 18. Okay, so I'm looking at this as a Muslim. What am I going to say? What's my response going to be? Is this Jesus talking? No, right? Is this Jesus talking? John 1? No, this is the prologue. This is John the author. Who's this? Do we know who he is? That's a tough question. When was John's gospel written? Very good. So the skeptical scholars will generally say 80 to 100. Some conservative scholars will put it as early as 70. Some scholars, like Daniel Wallace of Dallas Theological, puts it in the 50s. But the average scholar doesn't put it anywhere before the 80s and as late as 95 to 100 AD. Whoa, so you're telling me the first person to say Jesus was God was 70 years after he was crucified? No, I want to see it earlier. This is what I'm saying as a Muslim. I want to see it earlier. By the way, the arguments I'm giving you right now are from my Muslim perspective. We're going to have a much clearer version of all this stuff, so don't get confused. So as a Muslim, I'm saying I want to see the deity of Christ earlier in the Gospels. In fact, I want to see it at the earliest level. So what's the first Gospel? Mark. Cool. When was it written? 40, 70? What else do we hear? Can I get a 50? Can I get 55, 55, 60, 65? Okay, you have various views on when Mark was written. The ending of Mark, some people say, is written as early as the 30s or 40s. But in general, skeptical scholars do not put Mark before 70 AD. All right? So that's about the skeptical dating, 70 AD. And when I'm saying skeptical, I'm saying non-conservative Christian. So the average scholar who's not a conservative Christian would put it around 70 AD. Okay, first gospel. I want to see Jesus say that he is God in the Gospel of Mark. Because if it's not in the first gospel, that means it was probably invented somewhere between the first and the fourth gospel. Because why in the world would a gospel author, called an evangelist, why would an evangelist leave out the fact that Jesus claimed to be God? Does that make sense? We'd want to see it in the earliest gospel. And this is how I'm coming at it as a Muslim. And I said, I got to see this. Where does Jesus claim to be God? And so I started studying Mark with as much vigor as I could, coming from a total layman perspective. I mean, I was still a pre-med student at the time. And what I came to realize was when you read Mark's gospel through the correct lens, and that lens being a person who understands Jewish thought from the first century, then you begin to see what Mark is saying about Jesus. We'll go into more depth in a little bit, but what I want to tell you is that Mark 14:62 is Jesus' response to the Sanhedrin, specifically to the high priest in the Gospel of Mark. And the high priest is the person who is presiding over Israel. And here he asks Jesus, he demands of Jesus that Jesus say who he is. And what do we know from Romans 13? Talked about it yesterday, that the Lord has put authorities on top of us on this earth, and we're to listen to them. And if there was anyone who could demand that Jesus say who he is as a Jew, it would be the high priest. And Jesus, at that moment, makes it abundantly clear who he is. He makes it so clear that in verse 64, what does the high priest do? Tears open his robes, which isn't like him going, ugh. It's like, ah! Like, you know, Hulk Hogan style, WrestleMania, kind of rip it off. I've just heard blasphemy in my presence. This guy has just said something about his own identity that compromises the identity of the one true God. What do you all say about him? And they say, crucify him.